Hey, everybody. My name is Carl James. Welcome to Can I Have a Word, the podcast that explores the intersection between language and identity and how it shapes who we become. Now, I have a question for you. What is the true measure of success? Is it financial status, social standing, popularity, likes, or just achieving any goal you set for yourself? On today's episode, we examine how our vision of what success is and what success looks like changes throughout our lives and what we learn about ourselves through that evolution. I'm really excited to explore this topic with my guest today. This individual was my boss once upon a time, but we have also been allies, compatriots, and co-conspirators on a number of projects and initiatives, particularly those that focus on the LGBTQ+ community. And more than anything, he has been a trusted friend and confidant over the many years that we've known each other. When I decided to start this podcast, he was the very first person I thought of to be a guest. And fortunately, anytime I ask him for help, he's always there to support me. And so I'm really happy to have Peter Koffler here as my guest today.
Thank you, Carl. Good to be here. And right back at you on the compatriot, mentor, friend, all of the same, very mutual during our time at work together.
Yes, absolutely. So obviously, we have a very close relationship, I would say, and I know you in a particular context. But this is a slightly different venue for us. So I'm looking forward to getting to know you even better than I already do. So just to kind of get things started, just to do a little bit of a background. Tell me the story of your name, and that could be any way you want to define it. It could be sort of, were you named after someone? Does your name have a particular origin of, origin story? Anything that you want to speak to in reference to your name?
It's not so much a story as I would say a tradition, which is to say that particularly around the time I was born in the 50s, Jewish folks would name children after a deceased close relative. And I was named after my mother's grandfather. His name was Harry David. My name is Peter David. Now, particularly in those days, maybe a little less so today, they would take the first initial. How my mother got from Harry H to Peter P, I have no idea. My mother enjoyed being a little different, so I suspect she just thought that was a little different.
Got creative with it.
If there's something interesting, and it's interesting in a sad way, I didn't know my great-grandfather, obviously. I was named for him. He was lived in Russia. He was born in the mid-1800s, and he had a wife and 5 children, and his wife and 4 of them died in the bubonic plague. I mean, wow. You read about these things in history, and that, sadly, there you are. That
in your own family.
Right. So then he remarried, had 4 more kids, and they all immigrated to the United States around 1900.
Wow.
So not so much a story about my name as just some interesting background to the family.
Yeah, but it's got some context there.
Yeah.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up on Long Island in a little town called Jericho. If you've ever watched The Wonder Years,
yes,
that is the way I
Fresh
describe.
Savage.
Right, that's the way I describe the town. Sort of a mixture of blue collar and quasi-professional, very non-diverse, very apolitical, very much the Wonder Years.
But also very much the opposite of who you are today, which we will.
Yes,
get into.
I got off to a really slow start. In being exposed to things that interest me today. Just an example of that is the newspapers that were around our house, the New York Post and the Daily News. I don't think I saw the New York Times. Not to say the New York Times is the end all and be all, but I don't think I saw it until I got to college. So yes, a very different place where I started to where I think I am today and I aspire to be today.
Amazing. So as we do on this podcast, the focus is on language and words that shape us and define us in some way. And so at this point, I will ask you, Peter, what is your word?
Success.
Success. Okay. Now, a lot of us think, when we think of the word success, it could be the accomplishment of something, the attainment of fame or wealth or some sort of status, sort of very generic kind of a definition. But in your life, how do you think of success? Or maybe to start, how did you initially think of success?
So initially, and let me just flip it for a second, I'm struggling with the way one would define it today, both in my own life and more broadly. So I don't have ultimately a conclusion that I'm going to offer today, and this is how I recommend or live the definition of success. Rather, I'm still struggling and figuring it out. But initially, it was in a very, very traditional way, which is to say, um, growing up where success was narrowly defined based on financial wherewithal, grades in school, where one would go to college, and ultimately what profession one would choose. I grew up in a household where, even though it was it wasn't a household where we talked a lot about interesting things or whatever, but more where it was just a given. You worked hard to do well in school. Doing well in school was critical and expected.
Mhm.
And going to college, of course, was expected, and being a professional was expected. And in a Jewish family, being a doctor was, the ultimate achievement if you could manage that, which my older brother did end up as a doctor. But being a lawyer was okay too, and I ended up
So
as
that's
a
where
lawyer.
we ended up. Yep.
I ended up as a lawyer, and just a little bit of a funny anecdote. I don't know if it's funny, but side anecdote about that: my middle brother took a very alternative path in that he never went to college, kind of barely got out of high school, and dropped off the grid, as we would call it today, for a bunch of years. But then eventually landed in an okay place, got a job in construction, and became a project manager. And he's done that for the last 35 years. My mother, when she was alive, used to say she had three sons: a doctor, a lawyer, and an architect. He was a project manager, so that became an architect.
We dressed it up a little bit.
The point being that was the only way she could relate to what he was doing, was to put a professional label on it.
So your decision to go to law school, become a lawyer, had less to do with, say, maybe your own internal motivations, as opposed to like there was an expectation of these are the careers that are acceptable. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. I had no expectation and no sense of what being a lawyer was like. I don't think I even knew any lawyers growing up. Maybe a friend or two had a father or a mother as a lawyer, but I had no idea what it meant to be a lawyer. None. And I had no aspirations or childhood visions of that's what I want to do. No, it was, yeah, you're going to be a professional. I didn't like the sight of blood, so I wasn't going to medical school.
That was out.
Accounting seemed kind of boring, so I went to law school.
Okay, so we go to law school. What type of law interests us? What do you decide to sort of specialize in?
Again, very traditional, because I didn't really have any sense of the various paths one could pursue, right? You could be a lawyer and work in public service, whether it be a public defender, the ACLU, many different paths in which, or government, if you view that as public service. But I had no sense of that. To me, there was one path. You went into corporate law. So I got a job in corporate law. I spent some time at a law firm. Then I moved in-house to a client for many years. And then eventually in-house in financial services, where you and I met at a very prestigious financial services organization. And I've spent the last 18 years there. So it never dawned on me, or I never even appreciated the myriad paths you could follow as a lawyer. I just went the very traditional corporate finance, economically motivated path.
So you follow the path that was sort of expected. You kind of, for lack of a better term, you sort of checked the boxes along the way, kind of did the requisite things that you needed to do to sort of, quote unquote, attain success. So one could say that it worked. How do you view your career in terms of how you think about what success is?
So that's where in spending time in the last couple of weeks, particularly the last couple of days, thinking about this topic and reading some essays on the concept of success by some famous people. I read a long essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson on it. Didn't understand most of it. And then the other end of the spectrum is I read one by J.K. Rawlings, who wrote one. And what I took away from those were two things, which I didn't really relate to, and that is repeatedly talking about you have to be willing to fail in order to achieve success. That sounds good. I can own that, or not own it. I can see that that's a good thing. And I think folks today in their 20s or even 30s or maybe 40s, a willingness to say, you know what, after 3 or 4 or 5 years, I'm not particularly enjoying this. I want to go on a different path. And all 3 of my kids have made changes like that, my adult kids. In my generation, once you picked a profession or a direction, it was not cool to change.
I was just going to ask, because you brought up sort of this idea of enjoying it. If you're from a particular generation, I don't necessarily think that people always thought about, am I enjoying this? It's like, this is what I do, or this is who I am. This is how I define myself. Enjoying it was kind of a bonus, maybe. So I'm curious, along your professional journey, were you enjoying it, or did it feel like this was the choice I made? I'm good at this. I'm going to keep doing it. But you didn't necessarily always love it.
I was lucky. I've always enjoyed being a lawyer. Been a lawyer
Okay.
for 42 years, and I've enjoyed it. I like the profession. That said, if I didn't like it, I don't know what I would have done. I don't know that I would have had the guts to make a significant change of career path just because I didn't enjoy it. And back to a lot of the reading I've been doing recently, in addition to talking about not being afraid to fail, which is, again, a good concept, there was this strong sense of follow your dreams, pursue your passions. I wrote a couple of buzzwords: happiness and community, love of job, again, dreams, passions, and versus some of the things I said earlier: money, grades, school, jobs. And as much as I wanted to embrace that philosophy that many of these essays and interviews espoused, I couldn't get there. I couldn't get there because there's a reality, and I'm not suggesting that you just have to put your head down and be miserable. That's not what I'm suggesting. But on the other hand, this notion that you can look for something that you love and just follow your dream and be not think about anything else or not embrace the realities of life.
You got to eat. You got to have a place to live. You want to maybe go to a show, go to nice restaurants and do things. Yeah, like that has to be a consideration as well.
Yeah, and so that's right. And I think we live in a world, and I don't mean to become big, heavy philosophical now, but we live in a world, and we certainly live in a country where I'm not sure that we really do have the luxury to define success in sort of this Pollyannish way that a lot of these writers talked about. If I loved hiking, so what would I do for a living? If that was my passion, hiking, become a hiking guide? Oh, maybe. Live in the woods somewhere? Oh, maybe.
Not living in New York, you wouldn't.
Right. So,
necessarily.
So I've struggled as I've looked at this question with this notion of follow your dreams, to use a cliche, versus the reality of life, and as you say, paying your rent and so on. And where I think it's taking me is that there can't be success can't be one thing or one path. It has to be multiple parallel things and parallel paths. So you could have a profession that you like. I don't know too many people who love their profession. I don't know too many people who wake up in the morning and say, great, I'm going to go to work today. I'm so happy to go to work today.
Yeah, that's rare.
I do know some people who say, I enjoy what I do. I don't hate going to work. That's good. I don't know that it's realistic to say your job, your profession is something that you have to feel passionate about every day or has to be a fulfillment of your dream. I don't know. That's why I think you can have a second path or a third path that adds to your profession. Look, I would hate for one of my kids to do something as a profession that he or she hates.
Yeah.
But I'm realistic, and I know that any profession is going to have challenges to it. No matter how noble it is. In the not-for-profit world, there's a lot of challenges that you might not see from the outside once you get inside. One of my sons experienced that, and we'll talk about that. But I do think you can have multiple things going on that, as a package, make you feel like you've achieved some semblance of success.
So even before, we met, again, we worked together many years ago, but even before I sort of landed at the place where we did meet, I had been a performer. I had done some international health work. And so I felt like I was always somebody who was following my quote unquote passion, following my dream. And then it often got to a point where, kind of to your point, well, I thought about, well, how happy am I doing this? How sustainable is this? And particularly when I was a performer, I was like, I don't know that I can keep this going and be able to, meet the basic needs of life. And then I had this sort of moment where I had to question, do I abandon the passion and do something more practical? And I think that's a real dilemma. And then when you decide to make the practical choice, you almost feel like you've failed, which is, in some sense, the opposite of what you're trying to achieve by virtue of success. So it becomes this thing that you're constantly wrestling with: the passion, practical reality. What is success? Am I following my dreams? All of those things kind of keep shifting over time depending on where you are in life. So I just, reference that to say, like, that's a real dilemma that many people go through well into adulthood, by the way.
Agreed. And I think so. Now I'm 68, and I'm on a path to retirement from my current job, or retirement period. But I still think there is, I hope, another chapter in which I will add to the question of whether I feel like I succeeded. And I'm trying to figure out, as you and I have talked about this, what that might look like. Is what can I do with the next chapter that will make me feel more successful? Clearly, it's not going to be in the same way that I've achieved, at least on the outside, achieved success to date. It's not going to be financial related, economically related, professionally related. So what is it going to be? And I'm struggling to figure that out. There's many things one can do in the not-for-profit world, in the community service space, but it's little more difficult than I anticipated that to find a way to take who you are, what your skills might be, what you have to offer, and plug it into that world or the rest of the world. So hopefully I'm going to figure that out. To date, I've struggled with it a bit. But I want to, come back to where I started. I don't want to suggest that it would be a little disingenuous to suggest that I somehow had a problem with, or an issue with, the way I defined success, or the way it was defined for me when I was a kid, and that continued through recent times for me. I like the fact that people perceive me as successful. My perimeter of success are very much the traditional perimeters of success. Most of it is, frankly, built around economics and around my job.
Yeah.
I have a job at a very prestigious firm at a very senior level. And I'd lie if I say if I didn't enjoy the fact or
The fruits of that.
yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because it's in contrast to when I first got to the current place I'm at, having a bit of an underdog mentality because I didn't have the traditional background pieces or perimeters of success. I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I didn't come from a very prestigious law firm. I came from a good law firm, but not a very
Were you
prestigious
insecure about those things?
Definitely. Definitely. There was what was known as a resume that, of most people at the firm where you and I worked together that looked very different than my resume. And yes, so of course I was insecure about that. Even going back to my first job as a lawyer, most of the young lawyers there were from Ivy League law schools, Ivy League colleges. And I went to a state school in New York and a mid-tier law school. And the answer was very simple: work harder than everybody else, and you can overcome those
Overcome that,
disadvantages.
right?
Absolutely, that was the obvious, maybe the wrong answer, but the obvious answer to me was, just work harder than everybody else, and you'll be fine.
And it worked.
And it worked, and I'm proud of it, and I enjoy having that whatever you call it, that label of success. But I also appreciate the ambiguity. I don't know if that's the right word. The questions around, was I really successful? Could I have taken a different path and been more successful by defining success differently? If you define success at, again, now I'm going to go back to the essays and whatnot that I read about being, sort of Pollyannish. How many people did I help? How much suffering did I end or reduce? If you use that as the measuring sticks, I was not successful.
Well, if you're using those measures, I would say most of us probably aren't. But I think that does bring up an interesting point, because as much as I know you as sort of the lawyer and sort of the work you do in that regard, one of the things that we quickly bonded over and became very close through was our work with for the LGBT plus community. And so, talk a little bit about how you got involved in some of your more, I would say, your social advocacy work, which I think is a big part of your life. Maybe it hasn't always been, but certainly in the last few years that I've known you, it has been, and how that contributes to maybe how you've started to redefine what success looks like.
Yeah. So the way I originally got involved with the LGBTQ affinity group at our company was through somebody who worked in my group, and he was openly gay, and he was looking to form a network, and he asked me as a senior person if I would help him do that, and I was very willing to, because I thought it made a lot of sense. We were starting to form other networks at the firm, women's networks and diversity and inclusion networks. So we banded together, a few of us, and we got it started. And what I really enjoyed about it was it flipped around the usual dynamic. Rather than somebody who identified as LGBTQ feeling a little bit on the periphery in a more heterosexual community, I was more on the periphery in what was in many of our social events and gatherings. I was one of the few people who didn't identify as LGBTQ, and I can tell you that that community is much more welcoming to somebody who's not necessarily part of their community, or maybe as an ally, versus flip it around where a straight community does not reciprocate in the same way. So I learned a lot from that. I learned a lot about what it meant to be potentially an outsider, and what it meant to be feeling marginalized. And at the same time, one of my kids was pushing me hard to expand my thinking around social issues and political issues. And so I did a lot of reading around topics and authors and thinking that I knew nothing about previously. And it just, it helped me think about or appreciate that there's a lot of very different worlds and very different environments than the one I live in, where I raise my kids in Scarsdale, and where I live in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and so on.
So I can't pull up any stats on number of people's lives you've changed, but I will say, having met you when I met you, you quite literally changed my life. And, I've told you this before, when I first, started in sort of the corporate setting that we were in, I wanted no parts of anything dealing with the LGBT identity because I knew who I was, but I didn't think I needed to do that at work or that I should be showing that at work, particularly in the environment that we were in. And so it wasn't that I was ashamed of it. I just didn't think there was a place for me there. And it was because of you and how active you were and how involved you were. You quite literally um, strongly pushed me to get involved. And I know I was somewhat begrudging in the beginning, but that literally changed my professional life and it changed my work life because I suddenly felt like there was an avenue for me that I didn't know existed before. And then not only did I become involved, I became very active, as you know, and that was, a lot of the work that we did together was focusing on like, how can we continue to push this forward? And so I think it's really important for people to understand that the power that you have in motivating people, it's not always something that is conscious to you. It's sometimes just the visual example of you doing what seems very normal to you, but it had a profound impact on who I was and the person I became. And quite frankly, I might not even be doing what I'm doing right now were it not for your example. So a healthy thank you for everything that you've done in that regard.
Well, thank you very much for that. That means a lot. I do want to make two comments about it, though. One is, um, when thinking about how one goes about making that impact, um, two observations I want to make. It seems to me it should be easier or easy for people to do generally for two reasons. One is because how hard is it to just kind of not be an asshole? I mean, is that really that much of a challenge? I mean, is the bar that low that if you just treat people, and I don't mean to get on a soapbox now, please, not at all, but is it that hard if you just treat people with respect and a little bit of acceptance and respect? That is, if it just seems to me very easy to do. So I guess my point is, I think I get a little more credit than perhaps I should, because it should be the norm, not the exception.
I will agree. It should be the norm. I think it is much easier to focus on what benefits you and what suits you and what makes your life easier. Quite frankly, what you did in helping to start that network, the LGBT network, wasn't easy. You and I both know, like, we're talking about it here and sort of like, oh, I did this, you did this, and then that. There was much more to it than that. And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily go out of their way on behalf of a community that they're not a part of and don't have a direct tie to. So I think it's more the point that you saw a need, you felt like you could help, and you stepped in. But a lot of people don't necessarily do that. So I guess I'm curious, like, what in you inspired you, motivated you, or was it just like it was the right thing to do? So naturally you did it. How do you take those steps, particularly when there isn't necessarily a direct benefit or direct sort of like advantageous component to your career for doing it?
Yeah. So um, let's go back to where we started, defining success. And as I was saying earlier, having parallel paths. One is the more traditional, and one may be less traditional for me. In this case, working with the LGBTQ affinity group at work, getting involved in pro bono work at work, and some other related endeavors at work. It might be a little bit of me finding a rationale for how I can explain or justify that I spent my entire career in a very, yikes,
Corporate.
very corporate environment. Thank you. But at the same time, I tried to, and I don't think I woke up one morning and said, how can I marry a desire to do some good with the corporate environment I'm in? And I said, all right, this is what I'm going to do. It was more organic. But once I started to get involved and see how it affected people and how it affected me, I really enjoyed it. I still enjoy it. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to marry those two paths. And again, somebody might say, I'm not sure I buy it. I'm not sure that 42 years as a corporate lawyer, you offset that with 10 years involved in an LGBTQ affinity group. Okay, I'm not gonna debate whether or not they equal each other. They probably don't. But I do get some more than some. I get a lot of satisfaction out of that work. And I think you can marry two things: traditional definition of success, the more Pollyannish definition of success, the follow your dreams, do what feels good, make a difference, all of those things. You can do them both.
Yeah.
Is that what I think where I'm landing ultimately? I don't have any regrets about having been a corporate lawyer for 42 years. Had I done nothing else, I might say, hey, I don't know. Did I do enough? Probably not. But that's why I say I'm not done, hopefully. And now if the balance was tilted way towards being a corporate lawyer versus doing more other things, now the balance is going to shift. I'm not going to be a corporate lawyer at all, and I'm hopefully going to do all of the other things for the next chapter and maybe come closer to evening them out.
So kind of with that in mind, like trying to think about practical ways to help people, let's say, expand their definition around what success is or what success looks like or can be. How do we do that? So there's the sort of like the thing that's going to give me some level of financial comfort, but then there's also the thing that's going to feed my soul or make me feel good, knowing that I'm giving back. Like, what are those sort of maybe different slivers, or maybe those are the two? I don't know. Are there more things that we could be thinking about in terms of how we seek success, look for success?
I really like the way you said it, the feed your soul. That's a really good, I like that way of saying it and thinking about it. Look, I think I'm still struggling with it. I'm still figuring it out, but I'm okay with having two distinct and different paths towards that ultimate goal of success being, you have to check certain boxes, got to pay the rent, as we said earlier. And at the same time, you have to do other things that make you feel good, make you feel like you're making a little bit of a difference in some way. None of us is gonna, there's not many Mahatma Gandhis, Martin Luther King Jr.'s out there. So none of us, or very few of us, are going to change the world. But we can do something that changes, maybe make some small changes in the community around us. And I know, again, that sounds very kind of like, cliche-ish, but I really believe it.
That's your sphere of influence.
I really believe it, that you can make small differences that matter. And it's not hard to do. Yeah. So what's the advice? I think I missed your question.
Just to try to.
No. I'm there. So
I need it, but I'm sure other people need it too.
I think if I was, my kids are a little bit past that initial stage now, 2 in their 30s, 1 late 20s. So I think they've gone through that initial stage of, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that, and then landed where they seem to be solid in a career. Clearly, I would say, do not be afraid of saying, nope, wrong choice. Oops, I did the table thing. Clearly, don't be afraid of saying, I made the wrong choice and switching gears. Is there a point at which you become too old, in quotes, to do that? Maybe not. I don't know. But your 20s for sure is not it. And if you start out in one direction and then shift gears and say, I wouldn't advocate for anybody to follow a path that they truly don't like at all, or they find themselves miserable.
Just for the money.
Just for the money, just for the traditional box checking of success. But on the other hand, I'm not sure how realistic it is to say, find the thing that you love and you're passionate about. Every article I read was centered on that theme. And as I read them all, I kept thinking, who's paying the damn rent?
Truth.
So I don't want to sit here and say, like, that's what life is all about, paying the rent. It's not. And you can live in a community where the rent is less expensive than in other communities. I don't mean community, I mean literally cities and towns. You can go live in, some small town in New Mexico and not have to pay a lot of rent. If that's the way to get yourself to a place where you feel good. So I don't think it's one answer. I think there's multiple things you're going to do that as a package will define your success or whether you feel like you've achieved success.
I hear you. So now you are a grandparent. Got 2 grandkids, I believe.
2 and really 3. My daughter has a stepson, so Eli counts 2, so
Yes.
3.
All right. So now as you think about their upbringing and sort of the world that they will inherit, what do you, I don't want to say this like as some sort of like wise, older figure, but like, what do you hope to pass on, or what do you hope to share with them that maybe you didn't have when you were growing up that will help inform the choices that they make?
That's a good question, because my wife and I raised our kids with very traditional ideas around success. Do well in school. We moved to a community that had reputation of very good public schools. Do well in school, first and foremost. Go to a good college. Get a good job. Pick a profession. So we definitely raised our kids in that mode. Would I advise my kids to raise their kids in the same way? Boy, that's a tough one. I don't know. I used to say to my kids that one of the reasons you want to follow that more traditional path is because it'll give you options later on. If you then choose to go in a different direction, if you have the solid resume and the background and check those boxes, it'll make it easier to go in a different direction and you'll have more options available to you. I don't know, because that is a way to raising kids in that way is stressful.
Mm.
And I look back on it and I don't know. I don't know if it was the right thing or the wrong thing. And my daughter lives in a much more in a community now where she lives is less intense. Let's put it that way. It's not intense, but it's less intense, and it's more diverse, and it's more not just diverse in terms of ethnic and type racial backgrounds, but more in both, also professionally diverse. We used to say in Scarsdale, diversity meant that some of the dads worked at Morgan Stanley and some worked at Goldman Sachs. That's how you define diversity. This is a much more diverse community.
We've
professionally.
broadened that,
Yeah. And they're much more chill. Now, how will that evolve? How will they evolve when their kids are in first grade and 2 years old? So they haven't really been challenged with those questions around how hard are they going to push their kids to do well in school, to go to good colleges and be a professional, or are they going to be much more chill about all of that? That's a tough one.
I think it's a really difficult question, but one of the things that I know, and again, I'm of a different generation. Growing up, I never felt like I had the freedom to ask certain questions or even feel certain things. And I think one of the things that I see of today's generation is the ability to ask questions and to question things in general, and to not be afraid to challenge systems or challenge things that don't make sense or don't seem right, and to speak up more. And I'm not saying that will necessarily lead to quote unquote success, but I do think the ability to think more openly about what is possible for you and what something could look like is a means to achieving a different type of success. So it may not lead to a different choice of profession, but I think you'll see a wider range of possibilities for what your future can look like if you expand your mind in terms of like, why is this the way that it's done? Does it have to be done this way? Who's disadvantaged by this particular system? Why can't it look differently than this? And I think those questions that you start to ask yourself and encouraging people to think more introspectively about what is possible can lead to a different type of outcome or different type of success.
I agree. And I also think in a very, very practical way, I grew up in a time where my parents and grandparents lived on the same block practically. They all immigrated. All my grandparents immigrated from, did my wife's grandparents, immigrated from Eastern Europe, Russia in the early 1900s. They all lived in the same community. Then the parents lived down the block. And there was this notion that you just stayed together. And then even then in my generation, the big move was to go out to the suburbs. That was like the big shift. And then I'm seeing with my kids, with their friends, my kids are not necessarily decided yet, but all of them, that they're going right back to the communities where they were raised. And I'm a little surprised by that. Not to say that I'm not criticizing the communities where they were raised, but I do think that this notion that everybody has to be near each other in a family unit is a little stifling. As much as I want to be near my grandchildren, I think New York City or metropolitan New York may not be right for certain parts and members of my family, and they may be happier or better off somewhere else. I don't want to see them go. I'm not opening the door by any means, but I think that notion of rooted in a certain area is something that people need to break away from.
No, I agree with that. I live away from my family. I mean, a lot of reasons why I live away from my family, but I moved for career, but also to kind of see, like, spread my wings a little bit and just kind of see what I wanted to do kind of on my own. It's nice to have family. Like, they're right in DC. They're very easy to get to, but space is good, gives you some different options, and you kind of have to fend for yourself a little bit. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I do think that having the sort of the guts, the questioning, the interest in branching out, looking around, you may end up right back here. But being more open to exploring and looking around, I think, is a good and healthy thing. Just like coming back to a profession, if the first one doesn't work, try the next one or the next one or the next one. But as I said, in thinking about it, I'm not sure for many of us, for some of us may be lucky, but for many of us, there's perfection out there. There's the dream come true. Congratulations to those few who can find it.
Yep.
But I think it's a little bit unrealistic to think that that's out there for all of us.
Yeah. And while you're on that path to the dream, there are other smaller, maybe little nuggets of success along the way. So
yes. And I think that's really where I'm landing as I think about, was I successful? And it's looking at all of those things as a package, not, yes, I had a good career as a lawyer. And yes, I like that. And yes, I like when people look at me and say, you had a good career as a lawyer, but I'm hoping I can also feel like it was more than just that.
So I think we're nearing the end, but I just wanted to give you a little space. Any final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to share, add? I mean, you've given me certainly a lot of things to think about, but any final thoughts from your end?
I just come back to the one thing that we talked about around my involvement with the LGBTQ affinity group at work, and that is that I'm surprised by when I hear somebody say, it was so nice what you did, if around something like that or some other related thing, when I kind of step back and think about, well, again, the bar being too low these days. The bar of what is considered to be an important and nice gesture that shouldn't just be almost taken for granted, which I know, of course, it is not. And you and I are politically aligned, and I will not go down that road here.
It's
but
a different episode.
we live in a world where kindness and compassion and respect for people is just, there's
not
just
where it should be.
Just not where it should be. Just not. And I know that sounds preachy, but it's really, really sad that that's where we are. And I think we can make a difference. Yes, it touches or it gets to politics eventually, but even putting the politics aside.
Yeah, no, there are things that you can do even in your own family, in your own community, as you said before. So I think those are definitely things that we need to explore more and need to really take a hard look at what we are doing individually to contribute to improving that. Because it's not good. It's not great. But in this context, I think trying to have these types of conversations, I think, is helpful on some level. So I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to join me today. And again, just for the role that you've played in my life and, being a role model and a mentor and a friend and all the other things. I think you don't necessarily see how you've motivated people, myself included, but you've done a lot. And so I just hope you know that.
Thank you. Very grateful. I've enjoyed this. And hopefully when you look at the tape after it's done, you'll say, yeah, that was pretty good.
I'm sure I will. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Carl. My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.